Hello, everyone. Good to see everyone here. Welcome to the Net Impact virtual series on Reimagining Capitalism. As people continue to join this virtual series today, we invite you to share your name and where you're dialing in from in the chat. And before we officially get started with Peter and our esteemed guests today, Rebecca Henderson and Paul Solman, just wanted to go over a few Zoom tips with you. This conversation is being recorded. And I also wanted to share that Rebecca had a small technical glitch, or maybe bigger than a small technical glitch today, and her phone line went down, but she is calling in from a parking lot. So she has persevered to be with us today no matter what, but I'm just sharing that with you so you have an understanding of the background that she's calling in from. We also encourage you to have your video on, and you can click on the Start Video button on the bottom of your screen. That way you can see everybody else that has joined this call. And if you'd like to view only the fellow attendees that have their videos on, you can click on the video setting and click on Hide Non-Video Participants. We also encourage you to set your view to speaker view, which is in the upper right-hand corner. This will allow you to focus on the moderated part of the conversation. And finally, at about 10:35, we're going to open it up for Q&A. And at that point, you can write your questions into the chat, or you could click on the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen, and our host will unmute you in order for you to ask your question. So I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Peter Lupoff now.
Thanks, Bella. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for participating in this, our inaugural discussion around reimagining capitalism. As most of you know, Net Impact's mission is to inspire and equip emerging leaders to foment a just and sustainable world. We do this with programs, challenges, fellowships, and other projects and initiatives. Net Impact is a 28-year-old organization originally founded on the premise that business could be a force for good and that students shouldn't have to sacrifice values for a paycheck. Over these past 28 years, we've grown to service over 460 chapters, representing well over 160,000 members. This work is important. I think of it as covenantal. We are grateful for the opportunities to help prepare how we can our 160,000 boots on the ground. Net Impact is thankful too to those mission-aligned partners amongst companies, foundations, and individuals that fund our good works. Net Impact is really an affinity organization, a community of like-minded students, professionals of universities, companies, and foundations that believe that there are answers to and the energy and will amongst our community to address the world's most pressing problems. Some of the problems are systemic, and COVID and recent social justice atrocities in the US lay bare some of the flaws and suggest the mythology embedded in systems like capitalism. The affinity organization, our network, would ordinarily meet once a year at an annual conference. Last year, nearly 1,500 of us in Detroit. And this year, with the theme Reimagining Capitalism, we were to meet in Baltimore this October. The pandemic made this imprudent, but the theme, now our annual one, Reimagining Capitalism, is too important in this time and place to not hasten the discussion and create this series which commences today. Historically, capitalism as an economic system has stoked ambition, driven business formation, jobs, wealth, education, reduced hunger, bettered healthcare, housing, prospects, and contentment. Yet many people have been and continue to be excluded, marginalized, or exploited as part of these broader improvements. The world is saddled by persistent challenges, problems that no one feels particularly or directly accountable for, yet are roadblocks to the furtherance of a just and sustainable planet. The anger, anxiety, apathy of many regarding the state of things is in large part a function of feeling marginalized. If the few control the narrative, individuals have little influence as their voices aren't heard. Our NI20 Reimagining Capitalism speaker series, A Learning Journey, will draw our network into this discussion ratably with the stewards of capital and corporations and community legislators and activists. We, our Net Impact Network, can make a difference in driving better outcomes for people and planet. The flaws in capitalism may be repairable and perhaps evolve to be a better, more equitable version. NI20, Reimagining Capitalism, The Learning Journey, invites participants, you, to expand and deepen understanding of our current systems by engaging in conversation and reflection with our speakers and our global members. This is not an easy topic with clear solutions. We will ask difficult questions, challenge our assumptions, and discover our blind spots. Perhaps by unlearning what we know, together we can reimagine and visualize the world we want to create. Collectively and individually, we can be heard. We can exclaim, "Nothing about us without us," and make a difference. And so, with this, and again, welcome to all of you. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Rebecca Henderson. Rebecca is one of 25 university professors at Harvard, a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a fellow of both the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is an expert on innovation and organizational change, and her research explores the degree to which private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy, focusing particularly on the relationships between organizational purpose, innovation, and productivity in high-performance organizations. For several years, she's taught Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems, a course that grew from 28 students to over 300, and that is the basis for her current book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, a really important book, a book I think is a roadmap from here to there. Rebecca sits on the board of IDEX Laboratories and of Ceres. Rebecca will first present the topic, Reimagining Capitalism, and then participate in a fireside chat with Paul Solman, business and economics correspondent for PBS News Hour. Welcome, Rebecca.
Peter, thank you. It's a pleasure and delight to be here. My apologies for the fact that I'm sitting in a car in a parking lot right next to Starbucks, but our phone system crashed completely today. So I was delighted to be able to be here any way I could. In a moment, I'm going to try and summarize my book. That's 288 pages. I'm going to try and summarize it for you in 5 minutes. But I thought before I began, I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to write it and why I do this work. The world is on fire. Sometimes people say to me, "How did you know when you called your book Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire?" And I say, well, it wasn't that hard. You just had to look around. I don't know about you, but I'm finding this moment difficult. I'm incredibly privileged. I have a steady job, work I love, and our family is healthy. But it's still tough. It's really tough not to see friends. It's hard to see what's happening politically. I'm very aware of all the difficulties in the world. So let me tell you why I get up every morning and keep going. I want to tell you a story about my first husband. His name was John Huckra. He was born on the wrong side of the tracks in New Jersey. He was the first member of his family to go to college. His parents were first-generation Polish immigrants. And he became one of the most accomplished astronomers of the 20th century. He discovered there's a quasar whose name is Huckra's lens, and he discovered something called the Great Wall of the Universe, which is totally cool. Look it up if you're curious. He was a challenge to date. I remember our first date. We sat down together, and since we were both academics, I said, "Well, how many papers do you have?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, about 356, and I had 8. So I nearly got to my feet and just ran out. But he was an amazing man, funny, gentle, kind. So I married him despite the fact that he was one of the world's greatest astronomers. And we had a son. John was quite old when we met. He was in his 40s, and he had given up on the idea of having children. So when our son Harry was born, he was just over the moon, and he was an amazing dad. I don't want to tell you that our marriage was perfect. No marriage is perfect. And I used to scream at him on a regular basis, like, why haven't you picked up the dry cleaning? And why are you getting on planes to exotic places all the time? But it was a good marriage. And I took it for granted, the way one does. And then about 10 years ago, I came back from a business trip to find him on the floor. I thought at first he was playing with the cats, but he was dead. He was quite dead. He passed away at 61 from a massive heart attack. And maybe 61 feels old to you, but it doesn't to me. I'm going to be 61 next year. I was completely blindsided. The reason I'm telling you this is I want to tell you what I learned from this experience. Firstly, I learned to pay attention. Life is amazing and it goes by and we use it to do, random stuff. We should be celebrating. I should have been celebrating that someone full of life and energy and joy had chosen to share his life with me. I should have been paying attention all the time. So the first thing I learned was pay attention. The second thing I learned is that it's not death that's the tragedy. It's never having lived. When John died, people started coming up to me. I remember 3 days after he died, I was in the parking lot picking up our son from school. And a woman came up to me and said, I'm so sorry to hear about your husband. Well, I'm leaving mine. He's been abusing me for 10 years. And I was floored. I kept hearing stories like that. I kept hearing stories about anger and pain and death and bitterness. And it made me realize how lucky I had been to be married to John. Because he lived life full on. He couldn't believe he'd become a professor of astrophysics at Harvard. He really couldn't. He would, if a high school in California called him up and said, come and give us a talk, he'd get on the plane and do it. And then he'd come home and he would work and he would talk to anyone about his research. And he loved being alive. We'd go kayaking, we'd go mountain climbing. He was right there. And so I learned what I had known intellectually for a long time. I'm a Buddhist, and the Buddhists have, they say there's good news and bad news. So the good news is you're not going to die. The bad news is it's because you don't really exist. I really believe that. We are balls of electrons, collections of energy, moving through the world, and we dissipate, and that's okay. But while we're here, we should do everything we can. And the boundary between us and the rest of the world, it's so fluid. So I say, I think of myself as a song the universe is singing. So when people say, well, how do you do this work? How do you keep optimistic? How do you keep hopeful? I say, well, look, the world is on fire. What else are we going to do with our time? What are we going to do with our time? We have to address the problems that we face. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. Let me summarize Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire for you in 5 minutes. Here's the story. I open the book by suggesting that we live in a world that is radically out of balance. That yes, capitalism is fabulous. It's generated untold innovation and productivity and wealth and opportunity, but it's become radically out of balance with society. And so now we have firms who are pumping greenhouse gases out the window with no thought of their effect on climate change. We are looking at firms routinely excluding people, moving away from underprivileged neighborhoods. We're seeing inequality skyrocketing. We're seeing our institutions polarized and angry. We're seeing something that looks, at least to me, very close to social breakdown. Watching the murder of George Floyd, what kind of world are we living in? So we focused on making money. As business people, we put our heads down. We said, okay, it's about returning money to investors. And I'm a fan of returning money to investors. I teach at the Harvard Business School. I'm on 2 public boards. I'm up for giving money to investors. But it shouldn't be the goal. The goal of life, we have to breathe to live, but the goal of life is not breathing. So we need business to step up in this moment and help to radically rebalance our society. What does that mean? All the research suggests that a healthy society rests on three foundations: a free market, free politics, real democratically accountable, transparent government that can set the rules we need to hold capitalism in balance, to get that tiger back on its leash, and strong civil society and a strong voice for employees. So that's where we need to go. How do we go there? Easy. 5 steps, 288 pages. Step 1, we need to build purpose-driven businesses that create both economic value and social value, social and environmental value. In the book, I talk about 5 or 6 business models that can get us there. I give some examples of billion-dollar business models. I mean, Elon Musk is the most obvious, but my favorite is Erik Osmundsson, who's a Norwegian who's built a multi-billion-dollar business around recycling. He understood that the world was changing. He saw that recycling was the future. He went into high-tech, high-scale recycling. He's now the largest recycling company in Scandinavia, and he's helping to change the world. That's step 1. Step 2, realize that action by individual firms is not enough. So I cannot stress, the thing we should all be doing is looking around where we're working and saying, how do we create shared value? How do we find economic and social value, create it, and begin to make a difference? We can change hundreds of thousands, millions of lives like that. It can tip entire industries. I think we can see electric vehicles 5 years faster because of what Elon Musk has done with Tesla. So entrepreneurs moving first can really change things. But it's not enough. There are all kinds of problems we can only solve if we work together, because there simply isn't a business case for individual firms to do them. So what do we need to do? We need to learn to cooperate. So I talk a bunch about self-regulation, about firms coming together to clean up their supply chains, to make sure they use deforestation-free agricultural commodities, to address problems of human rights, to invest in education. So we need to find a way to work together, learning to cooperate. But that's not going to be enough. Why not? Because some firms are going to say, I don't want to cooperate. Let somebody else worry about social problems, nothing to do with me. So we need enforcers. 2 possible enforcers. First, finance. We need to rewire finance. I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'm just going to say that all the files around ESG is super important. It's very much in progress, but it's going to make a big difference. If investors step up and say, these things are worried about, climate change, inclusion, inequality, they're threats to the long-term health of our portfolio. We need to see action. Investors could make a huge difference. And indeed, that's already starting to happen. And last but not least, and now I'm back to the beginning, we need to rebuild government. We need to rediscover transparent, democratically accountable government. And in the book, I talk about times and places where businesses help to do that. I know it sounds like a long shot. When I was trying to sell this book, one of the publishers looked at me and said, "Business saves the world, Rebecca? You've got to be kidding. Have you read the papers?" But I think it can be done. Most importantly, I think it must be done. Thanks very much.
Paul, you're muted.
Still muted, Paul.
I see that, but I'd never muted myself to begin with. So the first thing I note is that Joni Mitchell was wrong. It's a good thing that they paved Paradise and put up a parking lot, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. For those who don't know me, and that's I assume most of you, I've been a business correspondent on public television, either locally or nationally, since 1977. I went to the Harvard Business School in 76, 77. I taught there in the 80s. I've been hearing this story, covering this story, about how businesses can change and be more socially responsible. I remember covering Earth Day in 1978, for example, now that I just think about the first Earth Day. What's different now? Why? My entire repertorial career, people have been talking about this, and look where we are.
We're in a bad place, but I think that's what changed. We're in a really bad place. When you have the governor of the Bank of England around saying that he thinks climate change could completely destabilize the world's financial markets, when you're looking at Houston having 500-year floods in 3 years, when you're looking at politics, which is so toxic, that governments across the world are paralyzed, and you're seeing the rise of populist autocrats like Putin or Erdogan or Bolsonaro. I hope I'm wrong, but when you're seeing so many people so angry and so afraid, it feels as if for 50 years, Paul, we were saying, if you don't shape up, the pitchforks and torches are going to arrive.
Yeah.
Now we have the pitchforks and the torches. I think that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing on our streets. I think you can feel that pressure building. And you can also see a real shift in how employees think about this. So when I first started here at the Harvard Business School, I didn't talk about this stuff. No one wanted to hear. Now, my students, when they look, where are they going to work? They want a company that's focused on this wavelength. I was talking recently to a big fossil fuel company telling me they're having trouble hiring because it's so unpopular to be doing these things. You're seeing customers beginning to switch where they buy, so that purpose-driven brands, sustainable brands are now growing at significantly faster rates than more conventional brands. So I know this is optimistic, but I think this is a moment. I say, I coded, which is awful. I mean, so many people are suffering in so many ways. People have lost their jobs. I bet there are people on this call who have lost their loved ones or their loved ones. But it has thrown into such sharp relief the fact that our society is not working. The fact that so-called essential workers don't have enough savings to enable them to stay home when they're sick, that they don't have sick days, they don't have paid sick time off. The fact that in this, one of the world's greatest pandemic, the federal government has, let me be polite, fumbled its response, so that years and years of saying government isn't important, drown it in a bathtub, are revealed to be a disaster. I mean, the whole the phone calls I'm having with CEOs and business people is completely different. So I think this is different. I think this is the moment.
Harvard Business Schools start out with how many people in your class? This is an elective. This is an elective, right? So yes, that students can choose or not choose to be. And now you've got 300 and some odd?
And now the dean has asked me to take over the required first-year course in leadership and corporate accountability, bring some of these ideas and some of these questions to the required first-year course. So now I had nearly 1,000 students. And as part of the required curriculum, we're saying, let's talk about inequality. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about systemic racism. Let's talk about whether you as business people have a role to play in addressing and responding to these problems. I mean, that's quite new.
Well, so I was at the school in the MBA program in the 70s, just for a year. You were in the MBA program in the 80s, right? Now, in my class, so 80 people, something like that, there were maybe 3 of us who I would have described as left in any way, shape, or form. In your class, what was the number?
There were 5 of us, and I'm still in touch with all of the other 4. Okay. We knew each other well.
It went from 3 to 5 in a decade. Where do you stand now compared to your students? Are you still way to the left of all the students in the MBA?
No, the students have gone way past me. I used to be the radical lefty. Now, when we asked the first year students, is capitalism broken? 50% of them said yes. One of those little put on your phone gizmos, 50% of first year MBA students say capitalism is broken. I mean, of course, not everyone agrees with me, although, but I would say a good third of the class is very significantly further left than I am, and roughly a third would be roughly where I am. And there's a third that's saying, well, I still think capitalism is great, and this sounds a little bit too much like socialism to me, but that you have a point. I mean, I think everyone can see that there's something going on here.
Somebody asked, I'm going to jump in right. Somebody asked, Michael Zakaris from Ashoka asks, how many of those 1,000 students will head straight to Goldman Sachs?
That's far fewer. It's quite striking. Some will. And, you can do good stuff from Goldman Sachs, and Goldman is trying hard to remake itself. Whether it will succeed, we don't know, but they claim they're trying. But it used to be that we had maybe a third of the class go straight to finance, PE, Goldman Sachs. That's down to, I believe, about 20%. And a lot of the people who go into finance now go to impact investing, go into ESG funds. I cannot tell you how many students I have in my office, now a virtual office, asking, what can I do? How can I make a difference in the world? I think the sense that there's no choice is really strong. And those ones that are not on this website, they're having serious trouble hiring.
Well, what about your colleagues? Where do you stand in relation to your colleagues? I would imagine that the finance department, for example, which is always perhaps the most prestigious part of the school, has not suddenly changed its tune and decided that maximizing shareholder value is out the window.
Well, the finance group has a couple of very well-regarded faculty who are teaching impact investing and teaching that there's a different way to think about finance. But you're right, the mainstream of the finance group is not singing hosannas for this agenda. I would guess, though, that half my colleagues are deeply engaged, really deeply engaged around this agenda, whether they're focusing on inequality or climate or the political problems that we face. It really feels so different than it did when I was first a faculty member years ago.
Has the school, in large measure, rejected what has been, after all, the paradigm of my entire repertorial lifetime, as I say, starting in the 80s, really, which is maximizing shareholder value? That the purpose, as you said it earlier, that the purpose of a firm is to reward its shareholders. And if you don't do that, and here was the key to the argument always, if you don't do that, the managers are going to appropriate the firm for their own purposes. Back in the 80s, I don't want to go into much detail here, back in the 80s, T. Boone Pickens, the famous corporate raider, picked out a guy who was running the CEO of an oil firm and said, look at the guy. He's got his own private plane. In the plane, he's got an organ. His name was Fred Hanley. And he's got a wine cellar. Well, I guess not a cellar if it's 30,000 feet in the air, but a wine something or other. And that's what happens if you don't have shareholder activists like T. Boone Pickens, because activism in those days meant taking over the firm, shedding the assets, and making more out of it. If you don't have people like that serving as the conscience of capitalism, are you not all afraid that that argument has some merit?
Of course that argument has merit. I tell you, I sit on a couple of big corporate boards. It always had merit, but it became the single mantra. It's as if we took one important idea and said nothing else was important. But the only thing that mattered was maximizing shareholder value. In fact, that came with a big asterisk. And the big asterisk was, as long as you have a strong government setting the rules, so that if you maximize shareholder value, you will do the right thing. So in a world in which we had comprehensive legislation, for example, so that if you emitted carbon pollution, you had to pay. If we had a world in which we had a strong safety net and really robust labor legislation, so that there was a strong minimum wage, and it was required that you gave people appropriate time off, and if our educational system was really strong so everyone could participate, and if our politics was really open and free and the popular voice could be really heard, then maximizing shareholder value would maximize prosperity and freedom, which is that's the original justification. That was the best way to run things. The trouble is that asterisk turned out to be super important. So what we say now is you have to keep your eye on that asterisk. If the state of politics is such that you can flood your local politician with money, you shouldn't do that. That's not consistent. Even if it will make you a lot of money, that's not consistent with the fundamental values that made you focus on shareholder value in the first place. And so we're really trying to widen the frame, and we're trying to do that both morally and tactically. Because of course I could say, well, morally you have to, pay attention to the bigger issues. That's why we're trying to link it with, and here's what you can do on the ground so you won't get fired. So you still have to make money, you still have to turn a profit, but you have no legal duty to maximize shareholder value right here, right now, except in the case of Revlon and Unical. But basically, you have a moral and an economic duty to focus on these larger issues.
But you're saying if we do this, if we do that, if we do that, we don't even have, you mentioned a carbon tax. We don't even have a carbon tax. We're not even close to having a carbon tax, which seems like it's the most obvious thing and actually would serve shareholder value, because it turns out that renewables are actually more cost effective, particularly now, given the externalities, the negative externalities of fossil fuels, not just us breathing the stuff, but in actually creating and getting rid of the waste. So what, I know you think everybody's now seeing the world's on fire. They're seeing it more than they used to. Harvard Business School is either turned around or they have very different recruiting admission standards, right? And they're bringing in more lefties than they ever did in the past. But we see no real progress on things which are in absolutely clear and present danger, right?
Oh, but we do see real progress. We see more than 2,000 firms signed up for Green Business, demanding that we get decent carbon regulation. We see individual firms committing to reducing their carbon footprint. We see a firm like Walmart that put $1 billion to the bottom line by increasing the efficiency of its trucking fleet. We see a firm like Enel, which was at one stage building a renewable power plant a week, now has discovered, as you say, that its renewable plants are much more profitable than its fossil fuel plants. We see an enormous decrease in the costs of solar and wind, driven partly by the subsidies from China and Germany, but also driven by the fact that hundreds and thousands of entrepreneurs leapt into the sector and drove those costs down. We see a transition in the automobile industry. Real conversation about it's got to be electrical, maybe it'll be autonomous, let's get the carbon out. We see in food, 67% of the world's traded palm oil agreeing to buy only sustainable palm oil. Before the recent change of regime in Brazil, we saw an almost complete halt to deforestation in the Amazon. We are, I hope, big double cross fingers here, seeing a very different conversation about race and inclusion, and that all has to be translated into action. But Paul, I am hearing senior managers say things I never thought any senior manager would say about how important this is. And underlying all of this is business case, is the realization that this is where the money is. And that's what's going to drive change.
Bob Willard writes, how helpful is it that the Business Roundtable redefine the purpose of a corporation as maximizing stakeholder well-being, a phrase I, again, have heard since the 1970s or 80s, early 80s at least, well-being versus maximizing shareholder wealth?
So talk is cheap, but one of the things we need to do is change the whole culture, how we talk about business, what we look to business for. And so having a really important group of firms say, oh, maybe we were wrong, maybe we should be more broadly focused, is giving license and help to firms that want to do that. So I think it's an example of the kind of change in rhetoric we're getting. When Larry Fink, who runs the largest pool of capital in the world, 6.6 or $7 trillion, some bizarre amount of money, sends a letter to every firm in which he holds stock, which is like every publicly traded firm on the planet, saying business should have a purpose, that's really interesting. I mean, the first time he did it, got calls from CEO friends saying, he doesn't mean it, right? But he kept saying it, and now he's saying, and if you don't, we'll vote against your board, and he's really starting to put teeth behind it. We have the Climate Action 100, which is 40 big investors, 40 trillion investments, focused on the biggest carbon emitters on the planet, telling them they have to have a plan to get off carbon. It's it's not nothing, Paul. I mean, yes, we face enormous problems, but I think there's a portion of the elite that's really moving, that's really beginning to move. And I just want to tell everyone that my battery is running low. And of course, I'm sitting in a car in a parking lot, so I may disappear, and I apologize profusely if that happens.
Can you turn on the car so that it can charge the
If I wasn't sitting in a rental car with a brand new computer, I could, yes.
I was just trying to be helpful. All right,
I just wanted to jump in. I'll just jump in for 1 second. Thank you, Rebecca, for letting us know that. And as we're naturally transitioning to questions from the audience, you can also raise your hand to those in the audience if you would like to come onto the screen to ask your question, for as long as we still have Rebecca. Or you could chat your question, and we've been tracking your questions in the chat. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, great. Larry Daly asks an intriguing question, I think. Businesses are rewarded, especially in the stock market, for short-term decision-making. Your proposals, Rebecca, require long-term disruptive change. How might we create short-term rewards for long-term thinking?
By really paying attention to good quality ESG metrics. That is by measuring progress towards those long-term goals. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics, let's take a social goal. Suppose you want to tell your investors, I want to treat my employees differently. I want to high road, I want to treat them with dignity and respect. I'm going to invest in training, I'm going to turn them over, I'm going to turn them over less often, I'm going to pay more. The investor is going to say, well, that sounds great, but in the short term, it's going to be costly. When are the returns coming? If you can measure that progress, you can then use that to tell your investor what you're doing and reward people inside the firm for doing it. So getting replicable, auditable, material ESG metrics is absolutely crucial.
Do you have any, what's an instance or an example of the stock market rewarding long-term as opposed to short-term thinking?
Amazon. Jeff Bezos lost, I forget how much money, enormous quantities of money for nearly 10 years, and his stock price stayed high. I was on the board of Amgen, a major biopharmaceutical company, for more than 10 years. We put every year billions of dollars into long-term research, and I mean really long-term. We didn't expect it to pay off for 12 or 15 years. Investors were fine with it. If you can find a way to talk about why the long-term will be profitable, investors will give you some slack.
This is from Carol Lynch, who says, seems to me that capitalism has drifted into its own form of socialized subsidization, meaning our largest corporations are the beneficiaries of major tax cuts and other incentives that place all the risk on consumers and citizens.
Absolutely. One of the really distressing trends in the last 10 years has been what's sometimes called the socialization of risk. So it used to be that companies gave steady jobs, which provided pensions and healthcare. And now it's like, oh, a gig economy, like manage your own career. It's part of the increasing political power of the business class. One of the strongest things I believe is that business should be lobbying to get rid of the ability of business to lobby. Legislation like Citizens United was a disaster and has to be reversed. So I think business has a very strong economic case for this. I think, in fact, this is taking business into a very bad place. More than 70% of Americans think the system is rigged against them. I think the chance of having a really either very right-wing populist government or left-wing populist government has gone significantly up, and neither are good for business. But yes, that's a tough collective action problem. I talk a little bit about it in my book. It has happened historically that the business class has stepped up and said, okay, we need to be controlled. That's absolutely a critical part of what needs to happen.
I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, Vusala Safarova, maybe. How do you have conscious capitalism, in quotes, in a without self-sabotaging, in a world where other players have to play the game of wild capitalism in order to catch up?
There's a bunch of new research in economics and psychology and behavioral economics suggesting that so-called conscious firms that run a high road employment model, authentic leadership, high levels of trust, that those firms can generate the productivity and innovation and creativity they need to pay for that higher business model. Not every firm in every industry. We have lots of data now that small high road firms can compete very successfully against low road firms, and particularly at moments of disruption. And that's what we're living through. I think these, highly conscious firms are in fact ideally positioned to take advantage of the challenges we're facing and to build strong business models on the top of them.
Inara Scott writes, I'm deeply troubled by the notion that maximizing shareholder value has a place in business, as Rebecca's just said, even in the presence of the asterisk she mentioned. That is an implicit, perhaps explicit surrender to shareholder capitalism. Why not say maximizing shareholder value should absolutely not be the goal and stakeholder capitalism should replace it?
If we could get really good measures of what it meant to be a stakeholder capitalist, and if firms would really really sort of report accurately, and if investors were willing to give their money to firms that were stakeholder managed, I think that would be fabulous. And when you turn around and you look at companies like the B corporations, those companies that have identified as B corporations have done exactly that.
Yes.
The trouble is, it's going to be a serious shift to take mainstream firms and push them in that direction. And the reason I'm nervous is if I think we said to Coca-Cola or Exxon tomorrow, oh, think about stakeholders, you don't have to deliver shareholder value, I don't know what they would do. There's no way of controlling them to make sure they actually deliver for stakeholders. So that's the issue we're battling with here, is how do we transition the capital markets so it's much more focused on the public goods in a way that means firms can get access to the investments they need.
So this is realpolitik for...
Yeah.
You're being realistic politically. Brianna Barbeau writes, I'm just concerned that many businesses may just be virtue signaling, she means, by signing on to these proposals, or like Larry Fink at BlackRock, writing about how he's going to be, all his businesses should be concerned about things like this. Maybe they're just doing it for show, right?
A bunch of them are just doing it for show. You should be concerned, but that's not all bad. Peter mentioned I was the Eastman Kodak professor at MIT. I studied firms like Eastman Kodak that were trying to change when the world was changing. And this is what change looks like, is you begin by issuing this kind of lukewarm statement or saying you're going to do something, and then your employees jump on you and jump up and down and say, like, what do you really mean? And your customers say, really? Do you mean it? And hopefully other firms in your industry say, no, you don't understand. We all need to clean up our supply chain or the whole industry goes down. I did a big talk to a group of people from the fashion industry, one of the most polluting industries on the planet, and one with horrible histories of labor relations. And that is an industry that's beginning to realize the whole business model is broken and they all have to move to fix it. That's not going to be easy, but that kind of pressure is building. Again, I'm not telling you this is a done deal. 5 easy steps, we're going to save the world. This is super hard. And to those of you who are inside firms trying to do this, I know how hard this is. It's sort of one light bulb at a time, one policy at a time, but that's what it's going to take. Is it starts with the statement, then you take the pilot project, then you move it into the mainstream. This is the change we have to throw our shoulders against.
Ann Webb, speaking of supply chains, Ann Webb asked, what associations are tackling supply chain sustainability and what companies are doing it right?
So no company is perfect, but for example, in the fashion business, Nike and Levi Strauss and Gap are trying really hard. The alliances that were put together after Rana Plaza
Are you there still? I think we may have lost her.
Yes, I think we've lost her, but we're working with her for her to dial back in. So
all right.
we'll just.
I'm going to read a couple of questions here that I think are interesting. Michael Zakaras, I think, from Ashoka writes about or that is Rebecca, shared that she's a Buddhist. I wonder if anywhere in the book she discusses greed and whether we can reinvent capitalism without grappling with greed in a fundamental way. And then goes on to say, imagine, for example, that Jeff Bezos felt shame for closing in on soon becoming a trillionaire, and that society saw this not as a success story, but as an example of how deeply broken our economic system is. I've read this book quite carefully, and no, there isn't a discussion in the book. In fact, I was very surprised. Maybe I missed it, but in the book. But I'm very surprised to hear Rebecca's opening about Buddhism and the extent to which she's obviously a devout Buddhist. But I think implicit in the success of the firms that are appealing to a broader notion of capitalism and reimagining it is a change with respect to the attitude towards greed. And I think that a lot of what she's saying, if she comes back on, she can tell me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of what she's saying and hoping for is not greed goes away. I mean, or nobody's ever greedy or nobody's ever acting in their self-interest. We all do to some extent. It's a question of the balance. How much do we cooperate versus, pursue self-interest at the expense of others? How much do we predate, in other words? And there's always some balance in, all organisms, as far as I know. That's how a community sustains itself. You can't have all predators. You can't have all cooperators, because there'll always be a mutant on the other side, and they'll then have an advantage. But it's a question of the tilt. And when she says one light bulb at a time, I think what she's meaning, I think she would agree with all of this. She and I have talked a lot, and I've done other sessions with her along these lines, that it's not that everybody goes, oh, greed is bad and not good anymore, and therefore we're going to change our tune, but that there's a tilt in the attitude towards it, and that eventually you even bring a Jeff Bezos on board, at least to the extent that he owns the Washington Post and is trying to change, is certainly bankrolling one of the big efforts to change the country politically by by holding people accountable for what they say and do. So I'm now answering the questions for Rebecca, but at least I'm as well situated as most. I'm better than most at being able to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. We're just, hopefully Rebecca will be able to dial back in. And
all right, let me read another question while that goes on. So this is from Havez Karimi. I don't know if I'll be in any position to answer this one, but I'm just seeing it coming up here. We pay twice as much as any other advanced country on earth for healthcare, and are the only country that doesn't cover all of our people. Most research, almost the only country. Most research I've studied shows that this is caused by the profit mode of insurance and pharmaceutical companies using perfectly inelastic demand, that is, demand that's not responsive to price, in order to gouge customers. Do you believe that universal care is possible? And if not, how should we justify why some people go without health care in our country? I'm sure Rebecca would not justify that or want to justify that, or think that it was any way legitimate to justify that. But the problems, of course, are it's not just, I think Rebecca would say, I would certainly say, and I'm the only person talking at the moment, so if you got nothing better to do, you'll have to stick with me for the time being here, I guess, is that it's not just caused by the profit motive. The healthcare problems not just caused by the profit motives of insurance and pharmaceutical companies, although they play a role. It's caused by marketing. It's caused by the fact that doctors in this country make more than they do anywhere else in the world by a huge factor. It's caused these days to a large extent by private equity, private pools of capital investing in and buying healthcare providers so that you, for example, might wind up going to an ER and not knowing that it's not covered by your health insurance, those of you who have health insurance, that it's not covered by health insurance because the ER has been bought by a private equity company that's out of network. So there are many, many factors that influence why healthcare in this country is so much more expensive than it is everywhere else with outcomes. And here's Rebecca back. And so I can stop filibustering.
Sorry about that, but yes, everything he said.
Oh, you were listening?
absolutely.
All right, well, why don't you pick it up? What about healthcare?
Oh, I didn't get to the question. I just got your answer. So
Oh,
let's move on to the next question.
okay, very good. Let's do that. Let's see. I'm curious to hear. Well, let's see whose question this is. This is Bella from the organization. I'm curious to hear more about what you think steps towards government transparency look like. In particular, budget decisions. Police defunding is a big point of contention right now.
So let's step back and think for a moment about what a really well-functioning government looks like. It has three elements. So it has ethical politicians who are committed to the strength of the democracy and the long-term good of the country as a whole. It has a transparent bureaucracy, a capable bureaucracy, one that people want to work for, that's considered to be a good job. And then the third element of that is a society that believes the democracy is working and is willing to vote and is willing to occasionally lose because they think the benefits of having this kind of everybody gets to have a say, yes, we disagree, but we work our way through, but that's worth having. And those three elements, when it's working well, you get a kind of positive circle going so that you get a great bureaucracy that enacts good policy, that then people get excited and they vote for the politicians that create that bureaucracy. I mean, the reason I mention this is we have kind of broken that circle big time here in the US. And so when we talk about an issue like police funding, we need to recreate trust at a very kind of deep level. So I think it's great that we can do it city by city, state by state. But yes, we need to see what the numbers are. People need to be very clear what it is we're funding and why. But it needs to be a conversation. One of the difficulties is it's not a democracy if you think the other side is evil and is trying to destroy the society. And we're at a moment when both sides of the divide are tempted to think that about the other side. So partly I think we need to rediscover mechanisms like citizen participation and open government. And these are not crazy ideas. I mean, this is how the Irish passed their abortion, repealed abortion, is through this kind of their abortion laws. This is through this kind of deep citizen engagement with people building trust on the ground. I think that's what we need to see.
Did you hear Michael Zaccharis's question about you as a Buddhist? Or were you off?
No, I didn't.
Okay,
I didn't. No.
He wrote and I answered the question. We'll see how close my answer comes to what you would have said, because that was what I was trying to do, answer in your voice. You shared that you're a Buddhist. I wonder if anywhere in your book you discuss greed and whether you can reinvent capitalism without grappling with greed in a fundamental way. Imagine, for example, Jeff Bezos felt shame for closing in on becoming a trillionaire, and that society saw this not as a success story, but as an example of how deeply broken our economic system really is.
So I have many friends who think the key to reimagining capitalism is reimagining ourselves, that we have to start with individual transformation and with a deep discussion about what it is we want from our lives and from our society. I am super sympathetic to that conversation, and it may be right. I am scared we do not have the time. So I'm a huge fan of people who are working on individual level transformation. I think we should very much try and change the conversation around consumption and around what the meaning of life is. But in the short term, I think we have to start moving as aggressively as we can on the things we can do right now as companies. So I'd like to sort of I'd like to work both sides, as it were, so individual transformation and structural transformation at the same time.
Do you think that there's a possibility that, given our the stay-at-home effect of the pandemic, that it will change our habits of consumption and our connection to, dependence on, slavishness to the consumer capitalism?
those of us who are privileged to be able to stay home, I think many of us are discovering that the important things in life were not quite what we thought. That being able to have dinner with friends, being able to hug someone, that being outside, that reading, that taking time for ourselves is worthwhile. That said, I don't want to underestimate. I mean, we are in the grip of a consuming machine, and as soon as we walk out, we have 1,000 signals flashing at us. So, you know, my motto is, my personal motto, and everybody has to make their own decision on this, is meditate like crazy, try and lead one's own life in accord with one's own values, which is well worth doing. I mean, we know the knock-on effects of changing your own behaviors are significant. The social psychologists tell us, for example, that if you decide to fly less, the odds that the people in your friend circle decide to fly less is quite significant. If you put solar panels on your roof, other people put solar panels on your roof. So let's change our own behaviors by all means, but let's not believe that's enough. We have to change the structure. We have to rebalance the system, and that means companies behaving in different ways and a significantly more engaged and responsive democracy.
Are you at all worried that if we all do change our method of consumption, or enough of us do, we don't fly anymore, for example, we don't use fossil fuels, that means untold tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs even lost, and people being in the same kind of despair that people have been in when manufacturing has ebbed in America over the last 50 years, and then turning to an autocrat or towards demagogues who say, no, it's somebody else's fault. I mean, in Texas alone, if they abandoned fossil fuel industry right now, there'd be a million or millions of jobs that would be lost, and people wouldn't know what to do, right?
Well, nobody's talking about doing this overnight. And we, in the fossil fuel transition, there's been a lot of work done on how we make sure we migrate the jobs. There are now far more jobs in the solar power industry than there are in coal or oil. And one of the things I think we should certainly do is subsidize, coal miners who are losing their jobs and helping to retrain them. To your broader question, am I afraid the economy would come to a shuddering halt if we stopped consuming? No, because I think we would consume other things. We would consume human connection. Imagine educational systems that really worked, where every child got the attention that they need. Imagine a healthcare system where it doesn't feel you're a number and everyone is run off their feet and crazy, a healthcare system built on care with enough time. Imagine investing in cleaning up our environment. And there's many, many human needs that could be met. And if that's what we decided we wanted to do as a society, that would create hundreds of millions of jobs.